I put a note up. I'm going out to play in the dirt on tomorrow, so there's no class next week because I won't be back until Monday. So anyway, sit and contemplate, go to another class. Don't skip. It gets you in trouble, right? But or enjoy yourself. I don't know. We're doing Romans. We're still in Romans, and I may have to do a third class. It depends on how far we get done. I'm way ahead of you guys, but you know that's the way it works. So my notes are still like 100 and something pages, but that's all right.
We're slow learners.
Well, no, you're good learners. I'm just thorough. Yeah. I want you to get your money's worth, right? If you don't get your money's worth, it's not worth it. But in any case, today the words of the day. And we will get to these words like we did just a while ago. This is E-N-T-O-L-E-S. Entoles. Entoles. From entolemai. Okay, what does that mean? Etola. Literally, let's see. In is the prefix, suffix, is a preposition that means in relation to something. So, you know, you could say in, at, on, etc. And guess what this word is? Telos. You guys kind of know what a telos is, right? A telos, let's use the geometric. Remember, the Greeks are geometric in the way they understand the world. So their language is geometric. And a telos is the projection, literally, of something on, it's the vanishing point. It's a projection on the vanishing point. Well, how does that help? It doesn't help, does it? Much. In English, we would kind of call this a conclusion. But it's not really a conclusion, right? And I'm telling you, the only way to grasp this is to grasp this with a picture. So see this? How many vanishing points are there? Infinite. Which is why a parable is a logos, an argument that has how many telos? One, a singular telos. So anyway, telos, in telos, this is on or in or at telos. So what does that mean? How do we fit that together? It's translated as a commandment or precept. That helps a little bit, doesn't it? So what do you think a at, in, or on telos would be?
Kind of the point to the argument.
A point, yeah, but what kind of point? A stated telos. A stated telos. Remember, what do you usually do in a Greek argument? Do they ever tell you what the telos is? No, they never tell you what the telos is. That's a Roman thing. Remember I told you in Aesop's Fables? Aesop's Fables, the telos is the what? The moral of the story. How many morals are in Greek Aesop's Fables? 0. Who added them? The Romans added them. Because the Romans always wanted an in telos. An intola. So guess what Paul is going to give them? An intola. Because they're Romans. You know, remember, our book is Romans. To the Romans. So guess what Paul's doing? He's writing to the Romans. This other word is one of my favorite words. E-P-I-T-H-E-M-I-A-I-S. You can pull that out. That's epithumias. Epithumia. Epithumia. And epithumia is a really neat word. Let's see if we can pull this one apart. I probably need a better color, because that's epidural, right? Epi means a relation of distribution, again, in case over, on, etc., rest. It would be something resting on or in, and thumos. So over, something over. And thumos literally means to breathe hard, smoke, blow. And in Greek means literally, this is the sacrifice. This is the smoke or the scent of the sacrifice. So literally, this epithumia means the scent of the sacrifice. You say, and this word is translated generally, I think it's mistranslated, but that's okay. It's translated in our English as lust, but it's more akin to the German Lust. Anybody know what German Lust means?
Want, hungry.
I want. Yeah, I want. It's basically a polite way of saying that I want something. I desire it. I want it. Not like in English we say I lust something. In German you say ich habe Lust. It means that I want it. I desire it. And so this is closer to that. But epithumia is a very, very, very important word in Greek. Because remember, how many times a year did people eat meat?
3 to 12.
Yeah, 3 to 12 is a beautiful, that is great, because we know the Hebrews probably got meat maybe 3 to 6 times. The Greeks probably 12 times, because every time you went to a festival, when did you get meat? At the festival. Why? They sacrificed. Yeah, they sacrificed. The leftovers of sacrifice. That's when you got to eat meat, is when it was sacrificed. People, you know, to us, meat is ubiquitous. To us, meat is something you have every day, right? In the ancient world, meat was rare. People rarely got meat. And so what did you do when you smelled the sacrifice? Epithumia. Epithumia. That's why, you know, although we put a very negative connotation on this word in our translations, it's not necessarily negative in Greek. Matter of fact, in Greek, it's a very positive thing. So, and by the way, this also tells you something else. Remember, in Hebraic culture, what did you do with, well, not all the sacrifices, but a lot of the sacrifices? They were Holocaust sacrifices. You burned it up. But yet well, remember, there's 5 sacrifices in Hebraic culture. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Anybody remember them? Ha, I haven't taught this in a long time. Anybody remember the 5 sacrifices? What's the first one? The first one is, think back to what we do in our services, and you'll know every one of them. The first thing we do in any service is, no we don't, invocation, ascension. Ascension. The ascension sacrifice. The first sacrifice is the ascension sacrifice. That basically says, hey God, we're here. And that's what we do. We have an ascension prayer. The second is sin, guilt. The sinner guilt sacrifice, these are, you can lump these together. This is confession. The second thing we do is confession. You would bring your sacrifice. If you had sinned unintentionally, you brought the sin sacrifice. If you weren't sure if you sinned or not, but you want to make sure you sacrificed, you brought the guilt sacrifice. So one or the other. The next one is the offering, which is the which sacrifice? Priest. The priest sacrifice, which is the homily and the offering. The priest sacrifice it's flour, and on top of the flour you put oil, and you mixed it with myrrh. And so you would take the myrrh and you take some of the flour and the oil, and that's what you would sacrifice, and guess who got the rest? The priest. But the final and most important sacrifice is which one? The Thanksgiving sacrifice. And everyone should know about that one, because guess what we say? This is our sacrifice of thanksgiving and praise before we do what? Eucharist. Because in the Messianic era, only one sacrifice is required, and that's the Eucharistic sacrifice. The Thanksgiving, by the way, Eucharist means good grace. Good grace. Literally, Eucharist, charis, and you. Good grace. Which is always a sacrifice made at a meal. So, in any case, these are the sacrifices that are made. And so, in the temple in Jerusalem, what would you expect to smell? Burning meat and hair and other things. Horrible. But in the Greek sacrifice, what would you expect to smell? Roast beef. See? And so, therefore, the epithumia, the scent of the sacrifice. We are in chapter 6 and 7. Oh, and I also make one more comment before we get deep into this. I'll make two more comments before we get into this. The two comments are these. Number one, I was talking about this about the Romans with a friend, and I made a comment to him as a pastor friend, and I said, he said to me, I made the comment about Romans, how the purpose of Romans was to answer the question for the Romans. The Romans knew that Jehovah had some authority or could help them, right? Because otherwise they wouldn't be going to the synagogue. The Roman question was, is this Jesus Savior guy applicable to us? Because remember, in city-states, when you moved to a city-state, whose gods did you worship? That city-states. And so the Romans are sitting there in their city-state, and they're asking the question, does this God and does this Jesus apply to us? Now, they were pretty much convinced about the God part, otherwise they wouldn't have been at the synagogue, right? They're God-fearers. But they wanted to know about this Jesus guy, and this is a question that Paul is answering in his Logos to tell us. Think about this. When Jesus Christ stood before Pilate, what did Pilate and the Romans do when they went to other countries? Did they bring their gods, or did they take those gods?
They allowed the people to worship the gods that they had.
They allowed the people to worship the gods they had, and they might have kind of, remember I told you that one of the big issues was that the priests, the high priests, one of the things that really ticked off Nero was the priest would sacrifice a sacrifice for Nero every day, and they stopped doing it, which really irritated Nero. They did it for the emperor in general. So guess what they were trying to do? Placate the gods of that area, but they still kept their gods, right? So when Jesus was standing before Pilate, what really got him going? When they said that he claims to be a king, and the people said, we have only one king, the emperor. The reason that's a big deal is, guess who was deified? The emperor. So this fact that Jesus was a king meant that he was potentially deified. And so you have Pilate. Pilate was acting not on a political whim or issue. He was acting at a very basal religious level to a degree. And not only that, when he asked Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? What did Jesus say? Yes. Ego eimi. Ego eimi. An emphatic Greek yes. Not only yes, but no kidding yes. So Pilate was reacting not just to a political issue. He was reacting to a religious issue. And so the point I'm making here is, remember, the Romans are asking this question. Very important question. By the way, we're a monotheistic group. We're monotheists that believe generally in the idea of the Jehovah God, right? But we have the same question. Does this Jesus guy apply to us? This is a question of culture and society. The other thing I want to mention is, let's get there. Paul begins his whole argument, this Logos Tetelos argument. He makes arguments against their gods, their idols, arguments against their Mysterion, arguments against their pathos and fate, arguments against their domestic lives, arguments against their basic nature. That he says no one, not even the Jews, can follow the law. All have therefore missed the mark, literally harmantia. That's what it means. What the word we translate sin is harmantia, means miss the mark. Everyone has missed the mark. And then the question, My evil increases God's goodness. And remember, there's a rabbinic answer to that question. Not at all. My evil increases the evil in the world. That's a rabbinic answer. The solution to miss the mark, according to Paul, is Jesus Christ. And he makes this long argument about how Jesus Christ is applicable because Abraham, remember? Abraham was convinced of what God could do before he was a Jew. And therefore, this applies. This Jesus Christ applies for that reason. The God of the Hebrews is the God of the Gentiles and the Romans. And the example, like I said, is Abraham, who was made equitable by persuasion before he was a Jew. And then the final point. For also to us whom God will credit righteousness, for us who believe, pistis, are persuaded in him. So, here's the point. Let me read this to you very closely. I can't remember what, I think this is 524, or maybe 424. But also for us to whom God will credit righteousness, literally diakosune. For us who are persuaded, who pistis, are persuaded in him who raised Jesus, our Lord, from the dead. So what is the focus of the persuasion? No, not at all. It's the opposite. It's the focus of the persuasion. Okay, did Jesus rise from the dead or not? It's a fact. Paul is it is a fact. The Romans knew this. The Greeks knew this. This Jesus guy, Egerio from Necros, rose from the dead. That isn't what is the question. That's a fact. You don't need to be persuaded. In our words, you don't have to have faith that Jesus rose from the dead. That's what Paul says. You don't need to have faith that Jesus rose from the dead. Why?
It happened.
Everybody knows it.
Everybody knew it was a fact.
Because it happened. It's a fact. I don't have to prove to you a fact. What you need to have pistis or be persuaded or have faith in is what?
That God made us.
That God, the Jehovah God, raised him from the dead. Because if the Jehovah God raised him from the dead, what does that mean? Paul already proved that this Jesus guy and this God guy are applicable to the Romans because of Abraham. So therefore, if he's applicable, what does that mean for us? For the Romans.
And it applies to all of us.
That if you are persuaded that that God raised Jesus from the dead, that's the reason he raised from the dead, that's the answer. Now, we are moving into a different area now. That was the proof text that Paul made to the Romans. But remember, Paul makes a statement that which is better, diakosune or agathos? Agathos. Good is better than equitable. Salvation gives you what? Equity, diakosune, the perfection that the Greeks looked for. But Paul is speaking to Romans. What do Romans want?
Glory.
Glory.
They want glory. They want doxa. And what is glory and doxa? Goodness. Good. So Paul is going to tell them how to be good. How do you be good? Agathos in the Greek word. How do you be good? This was not a problem that the Greeks saw because the Greeks wanted what? They wanted diakosune, but they called it charis. Charis. They wanted this graciousness of God. But the Romans were looking for something a little different. As a matter of fact, whenever you think of Greeks, do you think the Greeks were looking for glory? No, the Greeks were looking for philosophy. They're sitting around yakking, right? Who's looking for glory?
Romans.
The Romans. Think about this culturally. What are we looking for in our culture?
A job.
Yeah, there you go. The reality of life, right? Even if you're looking for a job, I would say everyone is looking for their 15 minutes of celebrity. Their fame. Fame and pleasure. You know what?
A pleasant life.
Does that sound like the Romans?
A little bit.
I would say it's exactly like the Romans. The only problem is the Romans had some kind of reality going on, well, for a while. But, this is the point. that Paul is now moving into this thing, and he's making his argument. Let's look at the argument. He is working his way into this. So in 7, this is chapter 6, 7. Because anyone who has died has been freed from sin. He's moving into this. This is an obvious argument, because remember, what is the ultimate Jewish solution to sin? Death. Because remember, there are 36 things that you can't use sacrifices to help. And especially, the big one is what? Intentional sin. So the Jews know this, and guess what? These Romans and Greeks have been trained by the Jews, and they understand this too. They understand it very well.
And they see the paradox.
Well, that's what Paul was pointing out to them. If they didn't see it before, they see it now. Because that's the whole point of his beginning argument, right? That the law is not sufficient to save you, because we know those 36 things you can't sacrifice for them. The Mosaic law is not going to help you. So what do you do? And his answer is Jesus Christ. His answer says Jesus Christ is the answer to miss the mark. But he goes on, and this point, this obvious argument that death frees you from the obligation of sin. The reason isn't because you're dead. The reason is because of why? You've been punished. You've been punished for your sin. The ultimate human punishment for sin is to die for that sin. Period. If you die for your sin, you don't have to pay for it, right? It's paid. What's the last words of Jesus Christ on the cross?
It is finished.
Which is what?
Meaningful.
Which is what? Telestai. Telestai. Telos. A telestai is when I stamp a bill. This isn't the exact meaning, but this is the exact use. When I stamp a logismoi, what's a logismoi? Is a invoice, and literally is a invoice of arguments. This is a word that Paul says when Abraham was, it was credited to Abraham. It says it was logizomoi to Abraham, which is literally it was made as an inventory of a logical argument, of logical arguments to Abraham. If I have a logizomoi and I stamp telestai on it, it means what? It was paid in full. The bill was paid in full. But literally, this word means the end telos, the final telos. So when Jesus Christ, who was the Logos of God, according to John, died on the cross, his last words were, I am the final telos.
Wouldn't the Greeks have a difficult time accepting that if they still believed in the geometric? I mean, isn't this a mind-changing event for them? I know we're talking about the Romans, but why wouldn't the Greeks have a problem with that?
Because if you have an inventory, let's say you have an inventory that lists payment, and you have a sum at the bottom, that's a single telos. That's an easy single telos.
I know, but the whole thing that you've taught us is that the vanishing point continually moves. Did it stop?
Well, yes, because remember, a parabola has one. A hyperbole has infinite, has many, and has many, and then a diabola has none. So, in reality, if I have a list, an inventory with cost, that's a single telos. I don't think the Greeks, this did not bother the Greeks. They saw this. To them, this whole concept of telos, they see this geometrically. And, when you have a mathematical equation, this is the point of mathematics.
So there is a solution.
There is a solution, well, until you get to my level of mathematics, and then you have a real problem. Because I can show you stuff that have
The Greek
infinite
argument
solutions.
for Christ was that we're switching it from the hyperbole view to a parabolic view. Is that what we're getting?
Well, I don't think it's as simple as that, because what we find, for example, is Luke, when I taught Luke, I need to teach the Gospel of Luke, the whole thing, but when I've talked about the Gospels, Luke is filled with hyperbole. Where Matthew and Mark, generally have a lot of parabola, and Luke has some parabola too, parables. But, Luke uses a lot of paradox and hyperbole, a lot more than the other Gospels. So it's not so much an end, it's a tool. It's not an end, it's a tool. It's a logos. Remember, all Greek is logos to telos. Logos to telos. And I put telos on the top so you don't see it as the end. It's not one telos necessarily. It can be multiple telos. It can be more than one, or, like the Gospels lead to a single telos. But in any case, let's go on. 8. Now, if we died with Christ, we pisteo, we are convinced that we will also live with him. Zeo, literally zeo. And this is true for both the Greeks and the Hebrews. For we know since Christ was egerio from necros, from raised from the dead. Remember, I'll make this point again. How many words in the ancient world are there for resurrection?
0.
There's none, there's 0. So you always have to say either egerios from necros, raised from the dead, or the other one, it's based in the market. It starts with an A, with an alpha. I can't remember. Anyway, there's 2 words that you can use in Greek, but you always have to say from necros, because there is no such thing as resurrection in any language in the ancient world. Resurrection is a modern era word. For we know that since Christ was raised from egerio, he cannot die again. Death no longer has mastery over him. Christ can't be killed again. There is no more punishment for sin because there can be no more punishment in this case. In other words, theologically, historically and theologically, Paul writes that Jesus Christ took on the sin, right, of the world, and then he died. What happens to the sin of the world?
Painful.
It was paid in full, and that's the point of the telestai. In death, he died. He died to sin once for all, but the life he lives to God. So Christ, remember, was that doron, that sacrifice. He was the death in place of the punishment for sin for the Jews and the Greeks. He hasn't moved this yet to the Romans. For the same way, count, literally, logizomai, take an inventory. In the same way, this is 11, take an inventory, yourselves dead to sin, but zeo, alive to God in Jesus Christ. Now he's applying the argument to the Romans. So, you see, before he said he was speaking to the Jews and to the Greeks. Now he says, in the same way, take an inventory of yourselves, dead to sin, but alive to God in Jesus Christ. So the argument of faith applies, the argument of pisteo, of convincing of faith, applies to the Romans as well as the Hebrews and the Greeks. 12. Therefore, do not let sin reign in your mortal body, literally soma. And this is very important. Soma. When I say soma to a Greek, what do I mean? Soma includes 3 parts. 1, 2, 3.
Sarx, suke,
Yep. Sarx. Very good. Suke and pneuma. Pneuma. Literally the flesh, the mind. It's a little more complex than that, but we've been through this before. The mind, the flesh, the mind, and the spirit, the soul. So he says, where am I? In 12. In 12. Therefore, do not let sin, hamartia, reign in your mortal body, your soma, so that you obey its evil desires. And okay, listen to what it says. It doesn't say evil desires. It says epithumia. Epithumia. What is he warning them against?
just the untamed
What's-
inklings, the untamed cravings of everything that you desire.
You're still gonna want
Well, that's good. That is good. That's approaching what I'm getting at here, but I think it's even more important than that. Before this, what were they following? Pantheonic paganism, right? And Mysterion. And Paul is telling them to stop doing what? If it's epithumia, it's the scent of the sacrifice. So he's telling them to stop following their previous gods. He's telling them, now he's not going to tell them, we're going to see what we've seen in other letters, he doesn't tell them to stop going to the festivals. If you stop doing that, what's going to happen to you?
Die.
You're toast. But stop being, and what you said is exactly right, stop being desirous of it. Do you see this? So if I'm like, I've mentioned this before, when you take your kids to the marketplace in Rome or Greece, what do your kids say? I want what?
Anything.
No, it's not I want anything, it's I want meat. I want meat. The smell of the meat permeates the marketplace because the sacrifices from the temple area is always next to the marketplace. So you always smell the scent of the sacrifice when you go to the market. So the kids are going, Mommy, Mommy, Daddy, Daddy, I want meat, I want meat, I want meat. And what do you think Mommy and Daddy are doing? Same thing. See? But what does that desire for the meat mean? What does that indicate in their culture?
So if you were saying stop losing your meat.
It's the sacrifices to the gods. So Paul isn't saying don't give up meat. He's not saying don't give up those. He's saying give up what?
Why are you eating it?
The desire for it. The desire. Because what he's going to talk about, this is a big thing. Dikasune versus agathos. Equity versus goodness. Let's see what he goes on to say.
Play the game, but don't believe in it.
If you don't play the game,
You're toast.
you die.
But it's okay to play the game, just don't believe in what the game's
You're
about.
saying act out the role but don't.
Now, this is very interesting because guess what? Jesus Christ, remember when we studied in Matthew, I mean, some of you guys were not in the Matthew study, but when we studied Matthew, one of the biggest points that Jesus Christ made, what word does Jesus Christ use over and over and over again on the Sermon on the High Place, Sermon on the Mount? Anybody remember? Huh? Suke. Suke. Christ's desire was that people would do what before they did things?
Engage your mind before your mouth.
They would engage their mind because this is not typical in their culture. In the ancient cultures, you typically did not engage your mind. This is one of the great things of modernism in the world. That we engage our minds, we have taught ourselves to think before we do things. Because one of the classic things in the ancient world is not to do that. It is not a typical thing. A lot of things are, we think that everyone in the ancient world is just like us. They're not just like us. They believed, for example, they were fated. That is one of the key concepts in pantheonic paganism, that we are fated. But what did Paul in Christianity tell us? You're not fated. Matter of fact, God is not fated. All the Greek gods, all the Roman gods were fated. And the fate of the gods is terrible. And the fate of man is terrible, pathos. And remember, the angelion, the news from the gods, is always bad. That's why Paul had a euangelion. Good news from the gods. Good news from God, literally. So the point here is that, instead of engaging, like for example, generally what would you do without thinking in this culture? I go to the festival and I eat the meat sacrificed to the idols. And Paul is saying to them, and what did, by the way, the Apostolic Council tell them to do?
Eat the meat, but not the sacrifice.
No, he said, don't eat meat sacrificed to idols. That's what they told them. That's what they told them. What did Paul tell them?
Say eat it, but you gotta make
Make
labor.
Don't accept it.
Paul said that it is, he made it, and we're not studying it, I think it's in Colossians, but there's a couple of places in his letters to the Greeks that his whole point is that it's okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols. It's okay to eat meat, which means that it's what? It's always been sacrificed, right? As long as you don't hurt your brother, you see? And so the answer to the question, Paul is saying, yes, it's okay to eat this meat sacrificed to idols. But what do you have to do?
Eat it for the right reason.
You have to eat it for the right reason. You have to be mindful of the fact. That's the suke thing. And by the way, go back and look at, if you have your Greek interlinear, go look at how many times Jesus Christ uses suke in the Sermon on the Mount in his talks, because it's full of it. Yes?
Was it a surprise when the man said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength"? Was that kind of a shocker to the people listening, or?
I'd have to, the problem with that in the, remember it's Septuagint quote, so it does say suke, but that is a quote from Deuteronomy. So I don't think that is so meaningful to them in that sense, because in the Hebraic thought, in Hebrew, in Hebrew they had Adam, and Nefesh. And Nefesh is not quite equal to thought. Nefesh is simply the breath of life. And so where thought comes from is not really something that is in Hebrew philosophy or the Old Testament documents. So it's really difficult to answer that question because it's a huge rabbinical question. I mean, that's a question rabbis didn't even care about where do thoughts come from. But we know what was important to the Greeks? Thought, yeah. Because the Greeks believed that you couldn't live without thinking. In other words, thinking is automatic. And so I think that when it says, for example, like you said, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and I'd have to look to see exactly what it says. I suspect that in the Septuagint it says Sart, Suke, and Pneuma. I'd like to look that up. I need to look that up. But I don't know. I haven't looked at it in a while. But I know it doesn't say that in the Hebrew. In the Hebrew, the closest it would get is Adam and Nefesh. Yes, ma'am.
So Paul was countermanding the Jerusalem council when he said they could eat the meat.
Yes.
It does. It says don't eat meat sacrificed to idols. I thought it was just strangled. But it doesn't say sacrificed to idols.
Right.
So,
Paul
he
did.
was not going against, so that's maybe why the Jews were mad at him. Then when you go to the synagogues, you go to a town and...
That could be a reason that they were mad at him. Yeah, I'll answer the question.
Okay.
What do you have?
Lionel, it's almost like Paul has opened the door to the slippery slope that continues to haunt us, in that the slippery slope being that if you don't use your suke and you do things without thinking through all of the things, that's when you run into trouble.
Well, let me give it to you, and I don't necessarily disagree with that, but let me give you two things that kind of will help with this. Number one, I think the reason that Paul quite obviously countered the Apostolic Council in suggesting they do this, and we know this because in his other letters, I've already quoted a few of them, paraphrase what it says, and we know that it says that. The reason Paul did that was, number one, if you did not eat the meat in the festivals, what would happen to you? They'd kill you. You would be killed. Pythagoreans were expurgated. The Pythagoreans, we know this about 300 BC, I believe. The Pythagoreans basically eschewed the festivals and said, we will not participate in the festivals, and they were eradicated. Basically, the Greeks rose up and killed them for that purpose. And I'm not sure any Pythagoreans exist anymore. That's why we don't know how they did the Pythagorean theorem geometrically. So, we know how to do it algebraically, but not geometrically. But anyway, in history, we have historical notes that this happened. So when Paul went to the Greeks and went to the Romans, matter of fact, if you remember the letter to the Colossians, I've taught that here before, Paul was telling them in Colossians to not only participate in the festivals, but to make your own festivals. And he tells that to the Thessalonians also, to not only participate in the festivals, but to make your own festivals. Why? Because the Christian festivals, then you bring people into the fold and you show them the Christian message and you get them, you teach them the Christian things. And that's what he wanted to do. As a matter of fact, we know they did. Because Christmas, what's Christmas?
Adaptation of a pagan holiday.
Christmas is the birth of Mithras. And so the Christians took it over. What's Easter?
Hestia.
Hestia. It's the festival of Hestia. the greatest Greek goddess. Vesta in Roman, Hestia in Greek. And so the Christians, guess why we have Easter? The Christians took over that festival and invited people to come and said, you know, we're having our festival too. We're celebrating the same festival as you, right? Come on over.
Tailgate.
Yeah.
And tell us that the festival was legal and not proselytizing, which was illegal.
Yes, that is correct. Because in the Roman Empire, you couldn't proselytize with a legitimate religion, a regio legis, but you could have festivals and you could celebrate. You could do all these things. So bringing people in, you know, basically they saw it as a mysterion. And the other point I'll make too, Paul lost this battle because there's another reason why Paul wanted them to be able to eat meat. Any idea? What was the Eucharist? What was the Lord's Supper?
Flesh and blood.
Common meal.
It started as a, when was it? It was a Passover, right? It's a Passover lamb. So if it's a Passover lamb, what do you have? You have lamb, right? It's lamb. And so when Jesus celebrated the Passover, he had the lamb, and he had the wine, and he had the bread, right? The matzah. Could you have a Passover without the lamb? No. So Paul, I know that Paul wanted to retain the Passover lamb even in the Greek world, even with the Gentiles, because he thought that would be a cohesive and great measure. And who got rid of it? Does anyone know how we lost the Passover lamb in Christianity?
The temple was destroyed.
Well, the temple was destroyed, but that's not why. John Chrysostom. You know, this is a guy you guys should have all studied because we do, all the services we do are based on John Chrysostom's Mass. John Chrysostom's Mass is what the Orthodox Church does right now. It's like a 6-hour Mass, guys. It's long. But every church, the Catholic Church does it, they've just shortened it. The Anglican Church does it, they shortened it. The Lutheran Church does it, we've shortened it. Everyone does John Chrysostom's Mass. And what did John Chrysostom's Mass do that all the other Eucharistic feasts never did? They got rid of, it made it a Mass, a sacrifice of bread and wine. It got rid of all the other accoutrements. Because what do we find them doing in the New Testament with the Eucharist? It's a Shabbat. It's a Shabbat meal. You know, it's a Passover Shabbat meal. You know, it's a potluck. And they just happen to do the bread and the wine as part of the potluck. However, it's supposed to have the meat. And Paul wanted them to be able to do that. John Chrysostom, I'm not criticizing John Chrysostom. I'm just pointing out historically why we got to where we got.
Why took it out?
Well, he did it for two reasons. Number one, expense is a really big problem. And matter of fact, okay, I'll go on a tangent, a real quick tangent on that, because that's a beautiful thing about cost. But cost is a huge driver, but the other one is, how did you get a Passover lamb?
Yeah, birds.
It had to be sacrificed at the temple, and the Antiochian, this is in Antioch, which is not far from Jerusalem, you know, they would not necessarily be able to get lambs, but they could probably get kosher lamb. But they would want to go to the temple, right? Because what were the Christians doing in the temple in Acts? What does anyone do in the temple? There's only one thing you do in the temple. You sacrifice. They weren't at the temple because they were preaching and teaching and learning. Where do you go to learn in Hebraic thought? To the synagogue. They were at the temple for one reason, and that was the Thanksgiving sacrifice. The only problem is the priests wouldn't let them do the Thanksgiving sacrifice until they did all the other sacrifices. And guess why the church in Jerusalem needed lots of money?
A lot of sacrifices.
Because they were doing sacrifices every day. The Thanksgiving sacrifice every day. Now, about cost. I love this. Why don't we have the Apocrypha in our Bibles? Because of cost. In 1826, the British Bible Society decided, because of cost reasons, to dump it. So therefore, now, theologically, everyone thinks that we shouldn't have the Apocrypha. But
We have the abridged.
everybody we had the abridged Bible. That's right,
The
today.
abridged religion.
That could be true too. Why do plain churches not have instruments? No, not at all. In early America, who could find an organ, or who could find a piano, or who could find someone who could play them? So guess what? They didn't play instruments. And guess what that turned into in their church? You suddenly begin to develop doctrine and theology around why we don't have instruments in our church. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not biblical. It's very interesting how you see this. You know, in the Catholic Church today, you know, they're slowly accepting more and more of Bibles in their church. But for years they didn't. Why?
Or literate. Start off as too expensive.
Well, it's too expensive. Why have Bibles for everybody? Because you don't need it, right? You have the creeds, right?
Some couldn't read it.
And many couldn't read. But in the modern era, they can. So you're seeing, you know, this is the thing. If there's no theological, and by the way, thank you for Vatican II, because Vatican II said it's okay to read the Scriptures. See the point? So this is something we got to be cautious of too, because we pull stuff out because of costs. Like, for example, why don't we have Eucharist every day? You know, Catholic churches have Eucharist every day.
Well, because they don't, they encourage a lot of times not taking the wine. They think it's complete just to take the wafer, and that's another cost issue. And they developed a doctrine as well. But that said, both the body and the blood were each the body and the blood, so it was okay to take one or the other.
Right. Well, that's why, you know, a lot of churches, for example, look, every church, even after the Reformation, did Eucharist every day if they could. In the Anglican Church, they couldn't afford to. Guess what they did? They would post a ban. You know, a ban of marriage. If anyone sees a reason why this couple should not be married, they post a ban of the covenant of Eucharist. So everyone prepare themselves, because on this certain day we're going to do the Eucharist. Because they couldn't afford to do it every day. But guess what? If you were a wealthy church, you would do it every day. Right?
You had a chapel right next to your house.
But there are a lot of churches nowadays that will not do Eucharist except on Sunday. Well, why? Because for cost reasons they didn't do it back forever, and now 100 years later, it's theology. See? We even have problems in our church if someone says, well, can we have Eucharist on Wednesday, or Eucharist on Thursday, or Eucharist... You know, there's a little bit of tension and fight, right? But ultimately we give up because we know it's not wrong. You see my point? And this is, what's that word? Anastasius? It's the word that means... Adiaphora. Adiaphora. You know, things that are not salvation issues that, you know, churches do and become doctrine and theology within the churches. But most of them are driven by cost, and that's the point I was going to make. Sorry. So let's go back. Therefore, don't return to the pagan mysterion past. That's in 12. Let's go to 13. I want to get through this whole chapter. Let's see if we can do that. Do not offer the parts of your body, literally the melos, literally the parts of your body, to hamartia, to sin, to miss the mark, as instruments of adikia, wickedness. Adikia doesn't exactly mean wickedness, but that's okay. But rather offer yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and offer the parts of your body to Him as instruments of diakosune. So this is the point that Paul makes. He says, you know, the parts of your body, you know, you got to go to the festival, you got to eat that meat, or you're going to have a serious problem. But don't offer your body, don't offer your mind to it. And when he says body, it's soma. So it's not just sarx. So he's argued this before. He's argued that the same pistis and charis applies to the Romans, and therefore the Romans must now act as if they have this same pistis. But the question is, how do you act? And also this agathos versus diakosune. So 14. For hamartia, for sin shall not be your master, because you are not under law, but under grace. Why aren't you under law anymore? Huh? Because who died?
Jesus died.
Sacrifice.
And you died in the baptism. Remember, that was last week. But you died. Paul said, In baptism, you died with Christ. So therefore, if you died and Christ died, remember, you have to have the law or else Christ's sacrifice is meaningless, right? But you're not under law anymore because you're dead to it. These are arguments. These are Greek arguments. 15. What then? Shall we sin because we are not under law but under grace? It's the third time he's asked this question, right? He asked before, shall we sin so that more grace comes about, or more goodness, God's grace comes about more? He asked the second time. This is the third time he's asked it. If he asked 3 times, is it important?
Yes.
Very important. Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to somebody to obey him as slaves, you are slaves to the one whom you obey, whether you are slaves to sin, harmantia, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness, to diakosune. And by the way, this is a dual thing. He's talking about 2 things here, right? Offering yourselves to what? Offering yourself to the gods that you worshiped before, offering yourself to the God that you're accepting now through Jesus Christ, right? So this is beautiful Greek. This is beautiful arguments. And we have to take them in that measure and understand that. 17, but thanks be to God that though you used to be slaves to sin, to harmantia, you wholeheartedly obeyed the form of teaching to which you were entrusted. That's the euangelion. You have been set free from sin and become slaves to righteousness. Slaves to diakosune. Now there's a problem with that. And they all get it. Can you be a slave to diakosune? Jesus Christ makes the same paradoxical statement in the Sermon on the Mount. Remember what he said about it? I can't remember it right off the top of my head, but it's about righteousness being exuberant. Those who are, can't remember offhand, but it's in the Greek. The point is that can you be a slave for diakosune? Diakosune means what?
You're not a slave.
In balance.
In balance. You can't be a slave. That's right. You can't be too slave or too free, right? If you're too free, you're not in balance. If you're too much a slave, you're not in balance, right? This is a paradoxical statement. Because what's Paul going to say to us? It's not diakosune you want, it's agathos. It's the good. Let's go on. 19. I put this in human terms because you're weak in your natural selves. Just as you used to offer the parts of your body, melios, in slavery to impurity, literally to the pagan gods in the festivals, and to ever-increasing wickedness. So now offer them in slavery to righteousness, to diakosune, leading to doxa, leading to holiness. When you were slaves to sin, slaves to harmantia, you were free from the control of diakosune. Is there any control in diakosune? Can you control diakosune? No, it's equitability. It's balance. If there's any control, it's because you're on the ball and you're balancing, right? What kind of control is that? I mean, that could be self-control, but it's not, this equitability thing. You're not free from the control of righteousness. Let's put it this way. If you were free from the control of righteousness, let's put it this way. If I'm on the ball and I stop moving and trying to balance, what happens?
You fall.
I miss the mark, right? And so he's making this statement in that context. What benefit did you reap at that time from the things that you are now ashamed of? Those things result in death. In 22, but now that you have been set free from sin, have become slaves to God, the benefit you reap leads to holiness. The result is eternal life. And this is our famous statement. For the wages, literally, this is beautiful what Paul writes in Greek. For the opsoion, the wages, literally the opsoion, the rations of a soldier, the rations of a legionnaire, the opsoion of sin, of harmantia, of missing the mark, is thantos, is death, and literally thantos is hell and death. But the charisma, the gratuity of God, is anos, literally perpetual zeo, life, in Jesus Christ our Lord. So, really neat stuff. Literally, the rations of a soldier. literal. I love that.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
This word holiness, what does that mean in the context of how Paul's using it?
There's two ways to look at, in holiness, we see holiness in two ways, either doxa or as in hagios. Hagios, generally a direct application. So hagios is an awful thing. And remember I told you that's, the concept is that when you see it, you fall on your face. So that's applied generally to, you know, when you say a holiness in terms of you see something that is awful like a demigod, you fall on your face. So God is you fall on your face. On the other hand, doxa is glory. Doxa is, by the way, what we mentioned, the Romans are seeking. And that holiness, that doxa, is basically that glory. And usually, you know, the difference in translation is usually holiness is translated from hagios, and doxa is glory, back and forth. But sometimes the two get kind of mixed up.
You know which one's used here?
Yeah, and this one is hagios. It's not doxa, I believe. Let's see. I think the bell is going to ring. But let's see what we got here for chapter 7:1. Do you know, brothers, for I'm speaking to men who know the law, that the law has authority over man as long as he lives. So Paul is both flattering them and recursing or readdressing his argument. And then this example. For example, by law, a married woman is bound, literally bind, duo, to her husband as long as she is alive. But if her husband dies, she's released from the law of marriage. So, Paul is going to give us another example. He's going to give us an example through marriage about the law. Before he gave us more direct, but this is typical of Greek arguments. What you do is you present your argument, you present your point, and then you give us, and I didn't get to the entole. We'll get to the entole next week where Paul gives us tell us. But in any case, thanks for your attention. We thank you, Father God, for your word. We pray that you continue to look at it, take care of us this week, and look after us. Help us to continue to learn. In your name we pray. Amen.
Walker sponsoring you next week?
Yeah, we're doing flight tests out here.
Oh, I thought you said you were going to play in the dirt.
I'm going to play in the dirt with an airplane.
Make a long dart out of it?
Because playing in the dirt at this time refers to racing in dirt in Florida for 2 weeks.
Well, I'm going to be racing, but it's going to be racing down a straight runway with an airplane at heavy gross weights and lots of stores on. To see what.
So you're going to get to actually shoot stuff?
No, we're just we're doing structural and performance testing. So
I would have thought that'd been done a long time ago. We're talking the AT6 now, aren't we?
yeah, the T6 is not dirt qualified, but the AT6 is. So we've tried it in dirt. We haven't gotten performance data, and we need to characterize some of the structural data.
Somehow this seems way late in the program to come up with this.
No.
Unless you're extremely confident of your mathematical models. Extremely confident.
Yeah, let's get data. So we know what
Came back home, the other one is,
Smith.
she's in Hong Kong right now.
I know, well, we had stuff we had to do.
Yeah, and their oldest daughter,
I'll be gone this week too.
was in Desert Storm with her husband.
But we
They
need
live
to know,
in
pick
Texas or wherever.
You said last week the word submission wasn't.
No, we moved to.
But it is. and it's good
We were,
for it to come up.
we lived in Wisconsin.
No, it's not in degrees.
That's what I want to know.
Well,
In other
it's-
words, you're saying that.
We're closer to the kids one
In, well.
Kansas City and
In,
Temple, Texas.
in Colossians.
And,
Submit is a poor translation.
Plus,
I think
plus we
it
like to
gives
go.
you the wrong impression. What is
Visiting
hupitasso? And hupitasso
Last 4
means
years we've been coming
have authority under. So for example, it says that Christ, hupotasso, that God hupotasso Christ. So God gave Christ authority under him over the earth. So when it says that wives hupotasso your husband, or actually it says husbands hupotasso your wives, it's saying that husbands give authority to your wives. Paul would never need to write to the Greeks for their wives to submit to them because they basically kept them in the gynoecea. You know, that would be insane. He's telling them to let their wives have authority in their household. So
that was in the context.
right, it's a new idea for the Greeks. But we translate it the way we do because I guess we want to keep women under submission or something. But there is no place where it says that women submit to your
I
husband.
get so confused because, you know, in confirmation we learned that holy men of God wrote the scripture, but it's been translated.
Well, it's translated directly. It's not translation of translation. But, you know, it's like I showed yesterday. Well, we'll get to it. There's no place in Romans where it says that you're supposed to obey civic authorities. When we get to that point,
I also read in a footnote that the word obey is not in scriptures that applies to wives. It never says that. It only as it applies to children.
yeah, I think so. I'd have to look back because I think I taught this in the Galatians or Colossians class. But the point is that the words used, the same word hupotasso, is used about God, about Christ under God,
Okay.
as is used about women under their husbands.
Okay.
So, are we saying that Christ submits himself to God? And I said, well, yeah, sure, but that's not how we translate it. We translate it that God gave authority to Christ. So, you know, why do we take one word and translate it one way in one part and then not translate the same way in the other part? And I argue that if you're going to translate that Christ, you know, God caused Christ to be submissive under him, you know, then women submit yourselves to your husband. Christ, submit yourself to God. That sounds irrational. That's not
It does.
right. But instead it's, you know, God gave authority to Christ
I understand.
on the
That's
creation.
good. I wish I'd known that many years ago.
Well, I think,
Saved me a lot of angst.
well, you know,
I don't think it's there to give anybody angst. I think society just happens to be that way.
well, you know, culturally, you know, like for example, in Romans it does not say to obey the civic authorities. But yet in the translation it says obey the civic authorities. But it's not, it doesn't say that. It says obviously obey the ecclesiastical authorities. So Paul was telling the Romans didn't need to know to obey the civic authorities. They needed to know to obey the ecclesiastical authorities. In other words, the authority of the people that were in the church over them. That's what he was talking about. But we have mistranslated that intentionally. Well, why? Because at one point the Anglican Church, the Lutheran Church, and the Catholic Church controlled the civic authorities. So put that in there so the
Came by
people
the
will
grace of
follow.
God. It
Yeah.
was always in the title.
And now it stays because we can't get rid of it. But you know, it doesn't say that at all. And when I get there, we'll see that.
Oh,
You know.
well, that's very helpful to me.
Some of the stuff is pretty well translated. I mean, the stuff today, you know, is just you can go bang, bang, bang through it. But you know, there are just places where it just glaringly is not right.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
You know, there's an interesting thought on translations, and we always come up with this trouble. And it's wonderful that Martin Luther wanted everybody to be able to read the Bible.
Uh-huh.
But it's expensive to have these translations, and they create problems sometimes. When you had Latin and Latin only, it was cheaper to teach you to learn Latin than it was to translate the Bible and produce 50 different translations.
Well, Martin Luther really did.